The air in the Oregon high country was ablaze, honed sharp by altitude and the coming autumn. It tasted of pine resin, damp earth, and a solitude so profound it had its own sound, a low hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. For Elias Vance, that sound was the only music he could stand anymore. It was the sound of peace, a fragile truce he'd negotiated with the ghosts that followed him home from the dust and rock of another world. At his side, moving with the fluid silence of a shadow, was Ghost. The German shepherd, his coat a shifting pattern of sable and silver, was more than a dog. He was an anchor, the one solid point in the swirling vortex of Elias's memory. A former military working dog, Ghost understood the language of silence better than any human. He didn't need words to know the tremors that still ran through the man beside him, the storms that gathered behind his eyes. It's a connection like that, a bond forged in shared experience and quiet understanding, that we try to capture in these stories. If you feel that same pull toward tales of loyalty and quiet courage, I hope you'll consider sticking around for the journey, maybe even subscribing to see where it leads. This morning, the rhythm was wrong. Ghost, who usually trotted with his head up, ears swiveling to track the scuttling of a squirrel or the distant call of a hawk, was tense. His movements were short, deliberate. His nose wasn't just sampling the air, it was interrogating it. He kept low to the ground, his powerful shoulders bunched. Elias stopped, resting the stock of his old hunting rifle against his thigh. He didn't call out. He just watched, his own senses sharpening in response to the dog's alarm. The forest was a tapestry of greens and browns, sunlight slanting through the dense canopy of Douglas firs and cathedral beams. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing sounded amiss. But Ghost was never wrong. He was a finely tuned instrument, and right now, he was sounding a note of deep unease. The dog moved forward, not toward the trail, but veering off into a thicket of ferns and salal bushes that choked the undergrowth. He cast a quick, intelligent glance back at Elias, a silent command. Follow. Elias shifted the rifle's weight, his thumb brushing the cool steel of the safety. His training, buried but never gone, surfaced like a submarine breaking the calm water of his mind. Assess the terrain. Identify points of cover. Scan for threats. The habits were so ingrained they felt less like thoughts and more like instinct. He followed Ghost, his boots making soft imprints in the mossy ground. Ghost led him to a small, eroded ravine, almost invisible from the main path. It was a scar in the earth, carved by decades of runoff, now overgrown and forgotten. At the bottom, half buried in a slurry of mud and decaying leaves, was a flicker of metal. It was an old-style military canteen, the olive-drab aluminum scoured and dented. A tattered canvas cover, bleached pale by sun and rain, still clung to its sides. Ghost stood over it, motionless, a low growl vibrating in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of profound sadness. A canine lament. Elias slid down the short, steep incline, his boots dislodging a cascade of pebbles. He knelt beside the canteen. This was old. Vietnam era, maybe older. The screw-top cap was attached by a thin chain, rusted but intact. It felt strangely heavy. He ran a gloved thumb over the initials crudely scratched into the metal. T.M. Who was T.M.? What was his story? Why was his canteen here, miles from any known trail or settlement, lost to the slow, grinding passage of time? He looked at Ghost, who had stopped growling and was now whining softly, his amber eyes fixed on the object. The dog's distress was a palpable thing, a current in the air. He nudged the canteen with his nose, then looked up at Elias, a clear and urgent plea in his gaze. Open it. Elias worked the cap. It was stiff, the thread seized by corrosion and grit. He braced the canteen against his knee and applied steady, patient pressure. His knuckles were white. The world seemed to fade away, the forest sounds muted, his focus narrowing to the single point of resistance between his hands. With a final, agonizing squeal of metal on metal, the cap broke free. The air that escaped from within wasn't the stale scent of stagnant water. It was dry, musty, carrying the faint, papery smell of age. He tilted the canteen, expecting a trickle of brown water, maybe a few pebbles. Instead, something solid rattled inside. It wasn't a sound of something loose, but of a carefully placed object. His heart, a slow and heavy drum in his chest, picked up its tempo. He appended the canteen over his hand. A small, dark object wrapped in oilcloth fell into his palm, followed by a shower of dried pine needles and dirt. It was a waterproof match case, the military-issue kind, but larger and heavier than standard. He carefully unwrapped the oilcloth, its surface stiff and cracked with age. Inside was a metal cylinder, about 3 inches long, sealed with wax. His training screamed at him. IED component, booby trap, but the context was wrong. This felt different. This felt like a time capsule. A message in a bottle cast into a sea of trees. He used the tip of his hunting knife to carefully scrape away the wax seal. The cap twisted off with surprising ease. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like raw cotton, was a tightly rolled sheaf of papers and a small, rectangular object wrapped in electrical tape. He recognized it instantly. A first-generation data storage device. A memory card, ancient by today's standards, but high-tech for the era this canteen seemed to hail from. His curiosity warred with a deeper, more somber feeling, the sense that he was intruding on something sacred, a final testament left to the woods. He unrolled the papers. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. It was a letter. The handwriting was tight, cramped, as if the author was trying to fit a lifetime onto a few small pages. To whoever finds this, it began. My name is Private Thomas Miller. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back, and it means they got away with it. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Ghost, who sat sentinel-like, watching him, his head cocked as if he, too, were listening to the words of the long-dead soldier. Elias continued to read, the forest around him seeming to hold its breath. The letter spoke of a covert mission, not in some foreign jungle, but here, in these mountains. Miller was part of a small Army Corps of Engineers unit assigned to a geological survey back in the late 70s. It was a cover story. Their real job was to oversee and document the disposal of chemical waste from a new, experimental manufacturing process. The contractor was a young, ambitious company called Veridian Dynamics. They were promised it was inert, harmless material. Miller, who had studied chemistry before enlisting, knew they were lying from the first day. The barrels were leaking a viscous, iridescent sludge that killed the vegetation it touched. The air around the disposal sites burned his lungs. The water in the nearby streams developed a strange, oily sheen. He started taking secret samples, running his own crude tests at night. He documented everything: the barrel markings, the dead wildlife, the strange sickness that began to afflict the men in his unit. Headaches, rashes, a persistent, metallic taste in their mouths. When he took his concerns to his commanding officer, he was told to stand down. He was threatened with a court-martial. Veridian had powerful friends in Washington. This project was a matter of national priority. Miller realized he was trapped. He was a witness to a crime he was being forced to participate in. The letter grew more desperate. They know I know, he wrote. The looks they give me. The accidents that have started happening. A faulty brake line. A rappel rope that came loose. I'm not going to make it off this mountain. They're going to bury me with their secrets. He described how he'd compiled his data, soil analyses, water toxicity reports, photographs of the illegal dumping, onto a single data card. He'd sealed it in the cylinder with this letter. This is my only shot. My Hail Mary. If I go down, I'm taking a piece of them with me. I'm burying this where I did my last survey, by the old crooked fir. Please, don't let them win. Don't let what we did here be forgotten. Tell my family. Tell them I was proud to serve, but this wasn't service. This was a sin. The letter ended with a final, heartbreaking plea to his wife, a litany of love and regret, of a future stolen. Elias's hands were shaking. The crisp mountain air felt thick, suffocating. He looked at the tarnished canteen, the faded initials TM, the primitive memory card. This wasn't just an old piece of gear. It was a tombstone, a confession, a last will and testament of a soldier betrayed not by an enemy in combat, but by the very people he'd sworn to serve. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Elias's cheek. Then another. He didn't try to stop them. He sat there in the ravine, the weight of a dead man's legacy in his hands, and wept. He wept for Thomas Miller, a soldier he'd never known, but whose burden he now shared. He wept for the betrayal, a poison that ran deeper than any chemical Veridian had dumped in the soil. He wept for himself, for the pieces of his own soul he'd left scattered in a war a world away, for the quiet peace he had come here to find, a peace that had just been irrevocably shattered. Ghost moved closer, pressing his heavy head into Elias's lap, a warm, living presence against the cold grief. The dog didn't lick his face or try to distract him. He just stayed, sharing the weight, his quiet solidarity a testament to a loyalty that needed no words. The sun filtered through the trees, dappling the forest floor, but for Elias, a long, dark shadow had just fallen over his sanctuary. He now held a dead man's war in his hands, and he knew, with the chilling certainty of a soldier who has seen the enemy's face, that this war was not over. It had just found a new soldier to fight it. The journey back to the cabin was a silent procession. The forest, which had been his sanctuary, now felt like a witness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed to echo the secrets buried beneath the soil. Elias walked with a new weight on his shoulders, one that had nothing to do with the rifle slung over his back or the canteen now nestled carefully in his pack. It was the weight of a promise made across 40 years of silence. Ghost stayed close, closer than usual, his body a constant, reassuring pressure against Elias's leg. He seemed to understand that the world had shifted on its axis. The fragile peace of their existence had been breached. Elias's cabin was a small, defiant outpost against the wilderness. Built of hand-hewn logs, with a wide porch and a stone chimney, it was more fortress than home. It was where he'd come to outrun the echoes of gunfire and the faces of the fallen. Inside, the space was Spartan, organized with military precision. A single cot, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves filled with books, history, philosophy, tactical manuals. There were no photographs, no mementos of a life before. The past was a country from which he was a permanent exile. He placed the canteen and its contents on the rough-hewn wooden table. The metal cylinder gleamed dully in the light from the single window. He stared at the memory card. It was a relic, an artifact from a digital stone age. His laptop, a modern, ruggedized piece of equipment, had no slot for something so ancient. He would need an adapter, something he was unlikely to find in Havenwood, the sleepy town nestled in the valley below. This was the first hurdle, a test of his resolve. For the rest of the day, Elias moved with a grim purpose he hadn't felt in years. He field-stripped and cleaned his rifle, the familiar, methodical process a calming ritual. He checked the perimeter of his property, his eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance, his mind mapping fields of fire, approach routes, and blind spots. It was an old, familiar dance. He was no longer a man seeking refuge. He was a soldier securing a position. Ghost watched him, his gaze unwavering. The dog didn't play or wander. He patrolled with Elias, a silent partner in a mission that was still taking shape. That night, sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a feverish mashup of his own war and the one Thomas Miller had fought. He saw the shimmering heat of an Afghan desert superimposed over the damp green of the Oregon forest. He saw the faces of his own lost men, their eyes accusing, their features blurring into the imagined face of Private Miller. He saw leaking barrels, their toxic contents seeping into the earth like black blood from a mortal wound. He woke up before dawn, the sheets soaked with sweat, the ghost of a scream caught in his throat. Ghost was there, his paws on the edge of the cot, his wet nose pressing against Elias's hand. The dog's presence was a lifeline, pulling him back from the drowning depths of memory. "Easy boy," Elias whispered, his voice rough. "Just a bad dream," but it wasn't. It was a memory and a premonition. He knew he couldn't stay isolated any longer. The data on that card was the key, but it was useless if he couldn't read it, and even more useless if he couldn't get it to the right people. But who were the right people? Miller's letter had made it clear that Veridian's influence ran deep. He couldn't trust the government, not at first. He needed an ally, someone on the outside. His first trip into Havenwood was a tactical operation. He drove his old, battered pickup truck, the one he used for supply runs every few months, but this time his mindset was different. He wasn't a recluse going to town. He was a soldier on reconnaissance. He parked on the main street, watching the slow rhythm of small-town life. People greeted each other by name. Kids rode their bikes without a care. It was a picture of idyllic peace, a peace he now knew was built on a foundation of poison. He saw the Veridian Dynamics logo on a small, modern office building at the edge of town. It was their regional headquarters, a clean, sterile presence that felt utterly alien in the rustic setting. They weren't just a ghost from the past. They were here, now. His destination was a small, cluttered electronics repair shop run by a man named Al. Al was a wiry, older man with a cascade of gray hair and a reputation for being able to fix anything from a toaster to a satellite phone. Elias had used him once before to repair a faulty solar panel inverter. He walked in, the bell over the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt jarringly out of place with his mood. "Vance," Al said, looking up from a tangle of wires. "Don't see you much. What's broke this time?" Elias placed the memory card on the counter. "I need to read this." Al picked it up, peering at it through his trifocals. He let out a low whistle. "Whoa, where'd you dig this up?" "This is a fossil. Haven't seen one of these in 20 years. Can you get the data off it?" Elias asked, keeping his voice level. "Maybe. I'd have to rig something up. Find an old reader, build an interface. It'll take time, and it won't be cheap. Just do it," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And Al, discretion is important." Al looked at him, his gaze sharp and intelligent. He saw something in Elias's eyes, a hardness, an urgency, that went beyond a simple request. He nodded slowly. "This is just between us, Vance. You got it." As Elias left the shop, he felt a prickle on the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched. He didn't turn his head. He used the reflection in a shop window to scan the street behind him. A dark sedan, clean and out of place among the dusty pickups and family minivans, was parked across the street. Two men in sharp, ill-fitting suits sat inside. They weren't looking at him directly, but their attention was a palpable force. They weren't locals. They were corporate soldiers. Veridian. How? How could they possibly know? Had they been tracking Miller's Canteen all these years? Did they have sensors, surveillance on the old dump sites? Or was it simpler? Had they seen him in town, a stranger asking questions, and flagged him as a potential threat? His mind raced, cataloging possibilities, discarding improbabilities. The most likely answer was the most chilling. They had never stopped watching. Their crime wasn't just in the past. It was an ongoing operation. Miller hadn't just been a loose end. He was the first of many. Elias got into his truck, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't look at the sedan. He started the engine and pulled out onto the street, driving at a steady, normal pace. But in his rearview mirror, the sedan pulled out too, keeping a professional distance. They weren't trying to be subtle. This was a message. "We see you. We know who you are. Drop it." The drive back to his cabin became a cat-and-mouse game. He took a series of winding back roads, testing them. The sedan followed, its movements smooth and practiced. These weren't clumsy thugs. They were professionals. Elias's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The quiet war he had inherited from Thomas Miller had just turned hot. He was no longer just the keeper of a secret. He was a target. And his fortress in the woods was about to become a battlefield. He looked at Ghost, who was sitting in the passenger seat, his ears erect, his gaze fixed on the side mirror, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The dog knew it too. The enemy was at the gate. Back at the cabin, the sense of violation was profound. His sanctuary had been marked. The sedan didn't follow him up the long, rutted dirt track that led to his property, but he knew they were out there, watching the entrance, establishing a perimeter. He was being boxed in. He moved with quiet urgency, his actions driven by years of training. He brought in extra firewood and water. He checked the loads in his spare magazines. He pulled out a set of old topographical maps and spread them across the table, studying the terrain, marking escape routes, ambush points, and defensible positions. He was one man and a dog against a corporation with seemingly limitless resources. The odds were impossible. Suicidal. A part of him, the part that had craved peace, screamed at him to take the canteen, drive in the opposite direction, and disappear forever. Let someone else fight this war. But then he saw the faded ink of Thomas Miller's letter in his mind's eye. Don't let them win. It was a command from the grave, a field order from a fallen soldier. And Elias Vance had never disobeyed an order. The first probe came after midnight. The moon was a sliver, hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The forest was wrapped in an oppressive, inky blackness. Elias was not asleep. He was sitting in the dark, his rifle across his lap, a mug of cold coffee on the floor beside him. Ghost was lying at the foot of the door, utterly still, but Elias could feel the tension coiled in the dog's body. An hour ago, Ghost's ears had twitched. A minute later, a faint, almost inaudible growl escaped his throat. They were coming. Elias had turned off the small generator that powered his few lights. He was a creature of the dark now, just like them. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the heavy curtains. He saw nothing but shades of black and gray, but he knew they were out there, moving through the trees with practiced skill. He could feel their presence, a disruption in the natural rhythm of the night. Ghost's growl deepened, becoming a low, menacing rumble. A floorboard on the porch creaked. It was a soft sound, almost lost in the sigh of the wind, but in the amplified silence of the cabin, it was as loud as a gunshot. Elias raised the rifle, the stock fitting into the familiar hollow of his shoulder. His breathing was slow and even, his heart a steady, powerful beat. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was an old friend. He knew how to manage it, how to use it. It made him sharp. A metallic click came from the direction of the front door lock. They were trying to pick it. Amateurs. Or perhaps they thought the cabin was empty, that he was still in town. He didn't move. Let them think it. Let them get complacent. The lock clicked again, and the door swung slowly inward, a rectangle of deeper blackness against the dark room. A figure, clad in black, slipped inside, a suppressed pistol held at the ready. A second figure followed. They moved with the economy of motion of trained operators, sweeping the small room with professional efficiency. Elias remained perfectly still in the corner, shrouded in shadow, a part of the darkness. They hadn't seen him. Ghost made his move. He didn't bark. He launched himself from the floor, a 75-pound missile of muscle and fury, a blur of gray and black. He hit the first man squarely in the chest, the impact driving the air from his lungs with a choked gasp. The man went down hard, his head cracking against the wooden floor. His partner spun around, surprised, raising his weapon. That was the opening Elias needed. He fired a single shot. Not from his rifle. That would be too loud, even in the remote woods, and would give away his exact position to anyone outside. He used the heavy, military-grade pistol he kept as a sidearm. The suppressor coughed, a sound like a hard-slapped book. The second intruder crumpled to the ground without a sound, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Ghost's panting and the gurgling sound from the man on the floor. Elias moved quickly. He checked both men. One was dead. The other, the one Ghost had taken down, was unconscious, his breathing ragged. They were well-equipped. Body armor, comms, high-end gear. This was no simple intimidation tactic. This was a wet team, an assassination squad. He dragged the dead man outside and the unconscious one inside, binding him securely to a chair with rope. He had to work fast. The men would have a third team member on overwatch, maybe more. They would know something had gone wrong. He had only minutes before they either retreated or mounted a full-scale assault. He went through the unconscious man's pockets. He found a wallet with a fake ID, a set of car keys, and a satellite phone. He powered on the phone, his fingers flying across the keypad. He navigated to the recent calls list. There was only one number, labeled Handler. His mind raced. What could he do? He couldn't call the police. Veridian might have them in their pocket. For all he knew, the local sheriff was on their payroll. He was completely, terrifyingly alone. Then an idea sparked. It was risky, reckless even, but it was better than waiting to be surrounded and killed. He looked at the bound man, who was beginning to stir, his eyelids fluttering. Elias knew he needed leverage. He needed information, and he needed to sow chaos among the enemy. He found the man's radio earpiece and put it in his own ear. He could hear the faint crackle of static. He waited. A voice, calm and professional, came through. Spectre 2, Sitrep. Over. Elias took a breath. He pressed the transmit button on the man's radio. He didn't try to imitate the man's voice. He spoke in his own, a low, steady baritone that carried the weight of combat. Spectre 2 is down, he said. Spectre 1 is gone. This is the asset. You made a mistake coming here. You have 30 seconds to pull your overwatch and disappear. If I see so much as a shadow after that, I'm going to put your man on the satellite phone with his handler and let you listen while I take him apart, piece by piece. Do you copy?" The silence on the other end was a confession of shock and disbelief. He had broken their protocol, seized control of their network, and turned their own man into a hostage. He was speaking their language, the brutal calculus of asymmetrical warfare. "Who is this?" the voice on the radio asked, a flicker of uncertainty in the professional tone. "I'm the guy who inherited Thomas Miller's war," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laden with menace. "Your 30 seconds are ticking." He cut the transmission. He looked over at his prisoner, whose eyes were now open, wide with fear and confusion. Elias gave him a cold, hard smile. "Welcome to my mountain," he said softly. The game had changed. He wasn't just defending anymore. He was fighting back. And the quiet man who had come to the woods to escape his demons had just shown the enemy that he had brought his demons with him. They were about to find out just how dangerous a man with nothing left to lose could be. The minutes after his transmission were the longest of Elias's life. He stood in the darkness of his cabin, the unconscious man tied to the chair, the dead one lying in the ferns outside, and listened. He listened for the sound of retreating footsteps, for the distant start of a vehicle engine. Or, he listened for the coordinated assault he knew would come if his bluff was called. Ghost stood beside him, a statue of tense muscle, his ears satellite dishes tracking every subtle shift in the night's soundscape. The dog's presence was a comfort, a silent affirmation that he was not entirely alone in this fight. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable. The crunch of gravel on the access road, the low rumble of an engine turning over and fading into the distance. They had blinked. They had pulled back. For now, Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was a temporary victory, a brief reprieve, but it had bought him time. Time he desperately needed. He turned his attention to the man in the chair. He was fully conscious now, his eyes darting around the rustic cabin, taking in the Spartan furnishings, the man who had so easily dispatched his team, and the formidable dog standing guard. Fear radiated from him. This wasn't the simple home of a hermit. It was the lair of a predator. "Who do you work for?" Elias asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The man, whose name was probably not on his fake ID, sneered, a pathetic attempt at bravado. "You think I'm going to tell you anything?" Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He walked over to the wood stove and picked up a long iron poker, its tip still holding a faint residual heat. He didn't brandish it. He just held it. "I spent 3 tours in places that make this forest look like a paradise. I learned things. Ways to ask questions. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this my way. But either way, before the sun comes up, I'm going to know everything. Who sent you? How many more are there? What's your objective?" He let the questions hang in the air. He watched the man's eyes, saw the flicker of defiance warring with a rising tide of terror. Elias had no intention of torturing him. The threat, the psychological pressure, was the weapon. He had seen enough pain in his life. He had no desire to create more. But the man in the chair didn't know that. All he saw was a stone-cold professional with dead eyes and a ghost dog, a man who had just killed his partner without breaking a sweat. The man's bravado crumbled. "Thorne," he stammered. "Marcus Thorne. He's Veridian's head of security. He runs the cleanup operations." "Cleanup?" "Yeah. Problems. Like you." The man swallowed hard. "Our objective was to retrieve the package and neutralize the threat. The package was priority 1. You were secondary." "The package?" "Miller's Canteen." The man nodded, his eyes wide. "How did you?" Thorne said it was a long shot. A ghost story. He never thought anyone would actually find it. Elias absorbed the information. Marcus Thorne, a name for the enemy. And they knew about the canteen, which meant they knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about covering up a 40-year-old crime. This was active, ongoing. What had Miller stumbled upon that was so important they were still killing to protect it 4 decades later? He left the man tied up and went back to the sat phone. He couldn't risk using it to call out. It would be traced instantly. But he could use it to listen. He reactivated the comms link. It was silent. They had likely switched frequencies. But he had what he needed for now. A name. A confirmation of the stakes. He knew he had to get the data off that card. Al was the key. But going back to town was a risk. Thorne's people would be watching, waiting. He had to assume every road was monitored, every face in town a potential spotter. He needed a different approach. He needed an ally who knew the local terrain, someone who could move without being seen. His mind went to Sarah Jenkins. She was a journalist for the Havenwood Chronicle, the small local paper. He'd seen her byline on a few articles questioning Veridian's environmental record, pointing out discrepancies in their public reports. They were cautious, carefully worded articles, likely constrained by a lack of hard evidence and the fear of a lawsuit from a corporate giant. But they showed she was digging. She had courage. She might be the only person in town who would believe him. Getting to her would be the challenge. He couldn't just walk into the newspaper office. He had to approach her on his own terms, in a way that wouldn't compromise her or lead Thorne's hunters to her door. He spent the next hour studying his maps, planning a route. He wouldn't use the roads. He would go on foot, through the dense forest, using the terrain for cover, a journey that would take him the better part of a day. Before he left, he dealt with his prisoner. He gagged him, secured his bindings, and left him in the cabin with a container of water. He was a hostage, a bargaining chip, and the dead man outside. He was a message. He dragged the body to the end of his access road, leaving it where it would be found. It was a brutal statement. This is what happens when you cross my threshold. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and lavender, Elias slipped out of the back of his cabin and into the trees, Ghost at his heels. The dog moved with an eerie silence, a phantom in the morning mist. Elias carried only the essentials: his rifle, a small pack with water and rations, Miller's canteen, and the heavy weight of his new purpose. He was moving towards civilization, but he felt as if he were heading deeper into enemy territory. The trek was arduous. He moved through thick underbrush, up steep ridges, and across shallow, ice-cold streams. He moved with the patience of a hunter, stopping frequently to listen, to scan his surroundings, his senses on high alert. He was back in his element, a ghost in a green jungle, and the familiar rhythms of stealth and survival were a cold comfort. He reached the outskirts of Havenwood as dusk began to settle, the sky turning a bruised purple. He skirted the town, keeping to the woods that bordered the residential areas. Sarah Jenkins lived in a small bungalow on the edge of town, a detail he'd learned from a quick search on the library's public computer during a previous supply run. He watched her house for a full hour from the cover of the trees, observing the pattern of lights, looking for any sign of surveillance. He saw nothing. No dark sedans, no men in suits. For now, she was clean. He waited until full darkness fell. Then, with Ghost on a silent stay command at the edge of the woods, he crossed the open space of her backyard, moving from shadow to shadow. He didn't knock on the front door. He circled to the back and tapped lightly on the kitchen window. Sarah Jenkins, a woman in her late 30s with tired, intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw, jumped. She peered out the window, her expression shifting from alarm to confusion as she saw the large, grim-faced man standing in her garden. She didn't recognize him. She started to reach for her phone. Elias held up one hand, a placating gesture. He held up Thomas Miller's canteen with the other. He spoke just loud enough for her to hear through the glass. "My name is Elias Vance. I read your articles on Veridian. I think I found the proof you've been looking for." Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a dawning, dangerous curiosity that was the hallmark of a true journalist. She hesitated for a moment, a war of caution and conviction playing out on her face. Then, she unlatched the back door and opened it a crack. "You better come in," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "And you better be telling the truth." Elias slipped inside, the warmth and light of the small house a stark contrast to the wild darkness he had traveled through. He had crossed a new line. He had brought his war into someone else's life. And as the door clicked shut behind him, he knew there was no turning back for either of them. Sarah Jenkins' kitchen smelled of coffee and paper. Stacks of newspapers, legal pads filled with notes, and red-ringed mugs covered every available surface. It was the command center of a one-woman army waging a low-grade war of information. She gestured for Elias to sit at the small table, her eyes never leaving his face, assessing him with a journalist's practiced skepticism. "Proof is a strong word, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I've been chasing whispers and circumstantial evidence about Veridian for 2 years. People are getting sick. The cancer rates in the county are triple the state average. But every time I get close to something solid, it disappears. Sources clam up, documents go missing. Elias didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed the canteen on the table between them. Then he laid out the wax-sealed cylinder, the ancient memory card, and Thomas Miller's faded letter. "This is more than a whisper," he said. He pushed the letter toward her. "Start here." She picked it up with a reverence usually reserved for ancient scrolls. She read in silence, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock, then to a deep, sorrowful anger. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the fragile paper. When she finished, she looked up at Elias, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "My God," she whispered. "Thomas Miller. He was one of the Havenwood heroes. There's a small plaque for him in the town square. Listed as killed in a training accident in '78. They said he fell during a mountaineering exercise. He was murdered," Elias said flatly. "He found out what Veridian was doing, and they silenced him. And this," she said, gesturing to the memory card. "This has his data, his proof. That's the problem. I can't read it. The technology is too old. I took it to a repairman in town, a man named Al. But before I could get back to him, Veridian's security showed up at my cabin." He recounted the night's events in terse, clipped sentences, omitting none of the violence. He told her about the two men, the firefight, the interrogation, and the name, Marcus Thorne. Sarah listened, her face growing paler with each word. The theoretical danger she had been writing about had just walked into her kitchen in the form of a haunted-looking veteran with a story that sounded like a paranoid fantasy, except for the tangible, tragic proof sitting on her table. "Thorne." She repeated the name, her voice tight. "He's their fixer. Ex-Special Forces. Now he runs Veridian's corporate security with a private army of mercenaries. He's the reason my sources are so terrified. He doesn't just silence people, he erases them." She stood up and began to pace the small kitchen. "They know you have this. They know you tried to access it. They'll be watching AL's shop. They'll be watching the whole town." "They are," Elias confirmed. "I have one of their men tied up in my cabin. But that won't hold them off for long. We need that data. Al is our only shot, but we can't go to him." "No," Sarah said, her mind working fast. "We can't. But maybe. Maybe he can come to us." She went to a drawer and pulled out an old, disposable flip phone. "Al is old school. He hates the internet. Thinks smartphones are tracking devices. He gave me this for emergencies. Said it was off the grid." She dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Al, it's Sarah Jenkins. I have a technical problem. A big one. It's related to the story I've been working on. The big 1 inch. There was a pause on the other end. The one that's going to get you stepped on. That's the one," she said. "I need your help. But you can't be seen helping me. And the person who needs your help can't be seen at all." Another long silence. Elias could hear the man's mind weighing the risks. "There's an old logging road that branches off Route 9, about 5 miles north of town," Al said finally. "It's been closed for years. Meet me at the washout in 2 hours. Come alone. And Sarah, be careful." He hung up. Sarah looked at Elias, a new fire in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was being burned away by adrenaline and purpose. "Okay, Mr. Vance. It looks like we're in business. Call me Elias," he said. The use of his first name felt like a significant concession, an acknowledgement of their new, fragile alliance. While they waited, Elias went to the edge of the woods to retrieve Ghost. The dog had remained exactly where he'd been told, a silent, patient guardian. He greeted Elias with a low whine and a nudge of his head, his senses immediately on alert in the new environment. When Sarah saw the dog, she took a step back. Ghost was an intimidating animal, all coiled power and watchful intelligence. "He's with me," Elias said simply. "He's a partner, not a pet." Ghost seemed to understand. He gave Sarah a long, assessing look, then sat quietly by Elias's feet, his presence a calming, grounding force in the tense atmosphere. The drive to the rendezvous point was nerve-wracking. Sarah drove her beat-up station wagon. Elias slouched down in the passenger seat, his rifle concealed under a blanket at his feet. Ghost lay on the floor in the back, invisible from the outside. Every pair of headlights in their rearview mirror felt like a threat, but they made it to the turnoff without incident. The logging road was barely passable, a ghost of a path being reclaimed by the forest. Two deep ruts in the earth, overgrown with weeds. They found AL's battered pickup truck parked by a collapsed culvert, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Al got out as they approached. He was holding a heavy canvas tool bag. He nodded at Sarah, then his eyes fell on Elias. "You're the one with the fossil," he said. It wasn't a question. Elias handed him the memory card. Al took it and peered at it with a small flashlight. "Yep, that's a genuine museum piece." He opened his bag and began pulling out a bewildering array of equipment. A small laptop, several strange-looking adapters connected by a tangle of wires, and a portable power pack. He had brought his workshop to them. "This might take a minute," he said, sitting on the tailgate of his truck and beginning to connect the components. Had to cannibalize an old mainframe reader from the county archives years ago. Never thought I'd use it. As Al worked, his fingers surprisingly nimble, Elias and Sarah stood watch, scanning the oppressive darkness of the surrounding forest. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the soft clicking of AL's keyboard. The air was thick with tension. They were exposed, vulnerable. "Almost there," Al muttered, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "The file structure is archaic, but it's not encrypted. Miller probably didn't know how." "Got it." A folder opened on the screen. It was filled with files. Scanned documents, low-resolution photographs, spreadsheets filled with chemical formulas and toxicity readings. "Play the one labeled Field Report 7, Sarah said, leaning in, her voice tight with anticipation. I'll click the file. It was a grainy, black-and-white video file, silent. The camera was shaky. It showed a clearing in a forest, lit by truck headlights. Men in military uniforms were rolling barrels off the back of a truck and dumping them into a massive, unlined pit. On the side of one of the barrels, a logo was clearly visible, the stylized V of Veridian Dynamics. "That's it," Sarah breathed. "That's the smoking gun." But there was more. Al scrolled through the documents. There were internal Veridian memos, signed by a name that made Sarah gasp. "Franklin Croft," she said. "He was the founder and CEO of Veridian. He died a few years ago, a beloved philanthropist." The memos detailed the cover-up, the bribing of officials, the creation of the training accident story to explain Miller's death. But the most damning files were the geological surveys. They showed that Veridian hadn't just used one dump site. They had used dozens, scattered all over the national forest. And they had deliberately chosen sites directly over the aquifer that supplied Havenwood and the entire valley with its drinking water. "This isn't just an old crime," Elias said, his voice grim. "They've been poisoning these people for 40 years. Suddenly, Ghost, who had been lying quietly, shot to his feet, a low, guttural growl erupting from his chest. He was staring intently into the darkness down the logging road. Elias raised his rifle. "We've got company." Far down the road, a pair of headlights cut through the night, bouncing and swaying as a vehicle navigated the rough terrain. They had been found. "Copy everything," Elias ordered Al. "Now." Al's hands flew across the keyboard, dragging files onto a new flash drive. "It's too much data. It's going to take a few minutes." "We don't have a few minutes," Elias said, his eyes fixed on the approaching lights. He looked at Sarah. "Get him out of here. Take the data you have and go. Get it somewhere safe. Get it online. Whatever you have to do." "What about you?" she cried, her face pale in the reflected glow of the headlights. "I'm going to buy you some time," Elias said. He turned to Al. "Give me the original card." Al handed it to him. Elias looked at the small piece of plastic, the sum total of Thomas Miller's sacrifice. He then looked at the approaching vehicle, now close enough that they could hear the powerful engine. It was a heavy-duty SUV, built for off-road pursuit. "Go," Elias yelled. "Now." Sarah didn't argue. She grabbed Al's arm, pulling him toward his truck. "Let's go, Al." Elias faded back from the road, melting into the shadows of the towering firs. Ghost was at his side, a silent, deadly shadow. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and his only allies were a small-town journalist and an aging repairman. But he held the proof, the legacy of a fallen soldier. And in the deep, dark woods of Oregon, Elias Vance prepared to make his stand. The hunter had become the hunted, and now he would become the hunter once more. The Veridian SUV skidded to a halt, its high beams slicing through the darkness and pinning Al's pickup in a blinding glare. Two doors opened, and 4 men spilled out, moving with tactical precision. They were dressed in the same black gear as the team from the cabin, armed with short-barreled rifles. They fanned out, using the SUV for cover, their weapons scanning the scene. They saw the abandoned laptop on the tailgate, the scattered wires, and 2 sets of fresh tire tracks leading away. But they didn't see Elias. "They've split up," one of the men shouted, his voice sharp and professional. 2 in the truck, heading south. "Where's the asset?" "No visual." "He's got to be in the trees," another voice answered. "Alpha team, you're on the truck. Pursue and intercept. Bravo with me. We're flushing the asset. He has the primary evidence. Do not let him escape." 2 of the men jumped back into the SUV and tore off down the logging road, their taillights disappearing around a bend. The remaining 2, moving with practiced ease, advanced toward the woods where Elias had vanished. They moved in a staggered formation, one providing cover while the other moved forward, their weapon-mounted lights cutting erratic paths through the undergrowth. Elias watched them from 30 yards deep in the forest, his back pressed against the rough bark of an ancient fir. He was invisible, a ghost in the gloom. Ghost lay at his feet, motionless, not even panting, a creature of pure, predatory patience. Elias slowed his breathing, letting the familiar cadence of combat take over. He wasn't the terrified man who had woken up screaming from nightmares. He was Sergeant Vance, squad leader, a man who thrived in the lethal geometry of a firefight. He had the advantage. This was his terrain. He knew its sounds, its smells, its shadows. To them, it was a dark, confusing maze. To him, it was home. He let them get closer, let them push deeper into the woods, further from the relative safety of the road. Their lights swept past his position, inches from his face, but they saw nothing. They were relying on technology. Elias was relying on instinct. He gave a soft, almost inaudible click of his tongue. It was the signal. Ghost exploded from his position, not at the men, but to their left, a gray streak moving through the ferns. He was a feint, a diversion. As predicted, both men spun toward the sound, their lights and rifles tracking the noise. "Contact left," one of them yelled into his radio. In that split second of distraction, Elias moved. He stepped out from behind the tree, raised his rifle, and fired 2 controlled shots. Pop, pop. The suppressed rounds were barely louder than twigs snapping underfoot. The first man went down without a sound. The second, realizing the deception too late, started to turn back. Elias's 3rd shot caught him in the center of his chest, punching through his body armor and dropping him to the forest floor. The silence that rushed back in was profound. Elias moved forward, Ghost reappearing at his side, as if from thin air. He checked the men. Both dead. He quickly stripped them of their ammunition, their radio, and a small night vision monocular. Supplies. He was re-equipping on the battlefield. He put in the earpiece. The radio was alive with chatter. "Bravo 1, what's your status? Do you have eyes on the asset?" "Over." Elias waited a beat. He knew they would have trackers on their men. They would know their positions had not changed. They would know something was wrong. "Bravo team is down," he said into the radio, his voice a low, cold whisper. "All of them. Thorne, you hear me? This is my forest. You sent 4 men. Now send the rest. I'm waiting." He didn't wait for a reply. He crushed the radio under his boot, cutting the link. He was sending a message directly to Marcus Thorne. He wasn't running. He was hunting. He took the original memory card from his pocket and placed it in the hand of one of the dead mercenaries. It was a calculated risk. Thorne's men would retrieve their dead, and they would find the card. They might believe it was the only copy, that Sarah and Al had escaped with nothing. It might buy them more time. It was a gambit, a piece of battlefield psychology designed to make his enemy underestimate the true scope of his loss. He knew Thorne's other team would be back as soon as they realized they couldn't catch Sarah and Al. He had to move. He couldn't go back to the cabin. It was compromised. He had to find a new position, a place to regroup and plan his next move. He faded back into the forest, Ghost moving ahead of him, his senses clearing a path through the darkness. Meanwhile, Sarah drove with a focused terror, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Al sat beside her, clutching the precious flash drive that held 40 years of poison and lies. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice shaky. "My office," Sarah said. "It's the only place with a secure, high-speed connection. If we can upload this to the cloud, to a server Thorne can't touch, then it doesn't matter what happens to us. The truth will be out there. They'll be looking for us, Sarah? In town. I know, she said, her jaw set. But they'll be looking for my car, for our faces. We're going in the back way. She parked several blocks from the newspaper office and led Al through a series of dark alleys and back gardens she knew from years of living in the small town. They slipped in through the back door of the Havenwood Chronicle, a small, two-room office that smelled of ink and stale coffee. The presses were silent. The only light was the blinking cursor on her computer screen. Okay, Al, she said, her voice low and urgent. Let's go to war. Al plugged the flash drive into her computer. The progress bar for the file transfer seemed to move with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the old building, every car that passed on the street outside, sounded like the arrival of Thorne's men. As the files uploaded, Sarah began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't just dumping the data, she was writing the story. The story of Private Thomas Miller, the story of Veridian's poison, the story of a town's long, slow sickness. She wrote with a clarity and fury she had never felt before. This wasn't just a story, it was an indictment, a eulogy, and a call to arms. Back in the forest, Elias found his sanctuary. It was a small, hidden cave he'd discovered months ago, its entrance concealed by a thick curtain of ivy. It was dry, defensible, with a clear view of the valley below. It would be his base of operations. He built a small, smokeless fire deep inside the cave, the flickering light dancing on the damp rock walls. Ghost lay at the entrance, a vigilant shadow, his eyes scanning the darkness. Elias sat by the fire, the night vision monocular pressed to his eye. He could see the lights of Havenwood, a small cluster of warmth and life in the vast darkness. He could see the headlights of vehicles moving on the main roads. He watched as two more of Veridian's black SUVs raced into town, their movements urgent and aggressive. They were converging, tightening the net. He had bought Sarah and Al some time, but the clock was ticking. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness that went deeper than just being physically alone. He was a man out of time, fighting a forgotten war for a town that didn't even know it was in danger. He thought of his own men, the ones he had lost. He had failed to bring them home. He would not fail Thomas Miller. He pulled the soldier's faded letter from his pocket. He read it again by the firelight, the words of a man reaching across the decades. Don't let them win. It was more than a plea. It was a transfer of command. The responsibility was his now. He carefully folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. He picked up his rifle, the cold steel a familiar comfort in his hands. He was outnumbered and outgunned. But the enemy had made a critical error. They thought they were hunting a man. They didn't realize they had cornered an animal in his own territory, an animal who would stop at nothing to protect his pack. The long night was just beginning. In the small, quiet office of the Havenwood Chronicle, the final file finished its upload. A small pop-up on Sarah's screen confirmed it. Transfer complete. A wave of relief so intense it was dizzying washed over her. She slumped back in her chair, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The data was safe, mirrored on servers across the world, protected by layers of encryption. The truth was now immortal. It's done, Al said, his voice filled with a weary awe. He pulled the flash drive from the computer and held it up. This little thing. It's going to burn them to the ground. Not yet, Sarah said, her focus returning. The data is useless without context. People need the story. She turned back to her screen, where she had already written thousands of words, weaving together Miller's testimony, the cold, hard data from the card, and her own years of research. She attached the key documents, the damning videos, the irrefutable proof. She addressed the email to a secure Dropbox for a consortium of national investigative journalists she had a trusted contact with. Her finger hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. The moment she clicked this, she would go from being a local nuisance to Veridian's most wanted enemy. Before she could click, the front door of the office splintered, exploding inward as it was kicked off its hinges. Marcus Thorne stood framed in the doorway, flanked by two of his heavily armed mercenaries. He was not what Sarah had expected. He was handsome, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, and he wore a smile that was both charming and utterly chilling. It didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. Sarah Jenkins, Thorne said, his voice as smooth as polished marble. "I'm so glad we finally get to meet. I'm a great admirer of your work." Such tenacity. He stepped into the office, his expensive shoes crunching on the broken wood. His eyes scanned the room, taking in Al, the computer, the flash drive in Al's hand. "And you must be Al, the magician. I'm afraid you're both going to have to come with me. We have a great deal to discuss." Al, despite his age, moved with surprising speed. He threw the flash drive at Thorne's face. "Run, Sarah," he yelled. It was a futile, heroic gesture. One of the mercenaries backhanded Al, sending the old man sprawling to the floor. As Thorne was momentarily distracted, Sarah slammed her hand down on the mouse, clicking send. The email vanished from her outbox. It was gone. It was free. A look of genuine annoyance crossed Thorne's perfect features. He looked at the screen, saw the empty outbox, and then looked back at Sarah. His smile was gone. "That was a mistake," he said, his voice losing its silken edge, replaced by something flat and brutal. "You've just made this so much more complicated for everyone." He nodded to his men. "Take them, and bring the hardware. I want our tech team to scrub everything. Find out where she sent it." As the mercenaries grabbed her, Sarah locked eyes with Thorne. There was no fear in her gaze, only defiance. "It's over, Thorne," she said, her voice steady. "You can't stop it now. You've already lost." Thorne's smile returned, colder than before. "My dear, you misunderstand," he said, leaning in close. "Losing is for people who have to play by the rules. I don't." From his cave high above the valley, Elias watched the town. Through the night vision monocular, he saw the black SUVs converge on the small building that housed the newspaper office. He saw figures move inside. He couldn't see what was happening, but he knew. They had found them. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, settled in his gut. He had led them right to her. He had brought the war to her doorstep, and she was paying the price. His first instinct was to charge down the mountain, a one-man army against an entrenched enemy. It would be suicide. He would be cut down before he got within 100 yards of the town. He forced the rage down, channeling it into cold, hard logic. He couldn't save them with brute force. He had to be smarter. He had to use Thorne's own tactics against him. He needed leverage. His mind went back to the prisoner in his cabin. He was the only card Elias had left to play. He had to get back there, but the woods between his position and the cabin would be swarming with Thorne's men, hunting for him. It was a journey he had to make. He gave Ghost a series of quiet commands, hand signals the dog understood perfectly. Scout. Circle wide. Silent alarm. Ghost acknowledged with a slight dip of his head and melted into the darkness. Elias followed, moving through the forest like a wraith. It was a slow, painstaking process. He moved 10 feet, then stopped, listening, watching, letting his senses and Ghosts probe the darkness ahead. Twice, they had to freeze as patrols swept through the woods nearby, their flashlights cutting through the trees. They passed within feet of Elias's position, but he and Ghost were just another part of the forest's deep shadows. It took him nearly 3 hours to cover the distance that had taken him 30 minutes in a straight line. As he approached his cabin, he could see that it was under observation. 2 of Thorne's men were positioned in the trees, watching the front door. They were waiting for him to return. He circled around to the back, where the woods grew thickest, right up to the rear wall of the cabin. Ghost was already there, waiting for him. The dog gave a low, almost inaudible woof to signal the all clear. Elias crept to the back window, the one he always left slightly ajar for ventilation. He slipped inside, silent as a cat. The cabin was just as he had left it. The mercenary was still tied to the chair, gagged and unconscious. Elias checked his pulse. Still alive. Good. He went to the satellite phone he had taken from the man. He knew Thorne would have the number. He was counting on it. He powered it on. It rang almost immediately. Elias let it ring 3 times before answering. "Vance," he said. "Well, hello, asset." Marcus Thorne's smooth voice purred from the other end. "I was hoping you'd call. I have some friends of yours here. A journalist and a very talented, if misguided, electronics enthusiast. They're a little tied up at the moment, but I'm sure they'd love to say hello." "Let them go, Thorne," Elias said, his voice level. Thorne laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Now, why would I do that? They're my leverage. See, I have what you care about. You have. Well, you have nothing. That's where you're wrong," Elias said. He walked over to his prisoner and pulled the gag from his mouth. He put the phone on speaker. I have your man. Spectre 2, I believe you call him. He's alive. For now. The man in the chair, groggy and terrified, started babbling. Boss, it's me. Get me out of here. This guy is crazy. There was a moment of silence on Thorne's end. Elias could almost hear the man's mind recalibrating. A single soldier is hardly equivalent to the key witnesses in a multi-billion-dollar corporate malfeasance case, Thorne said, his voice losing a fraction of its composure. He's not just a soldier, Elias said, a new, daring plan forming in his mind. He's your brother-in-law, isn't he? David, your wife's younger brother. The one you got this security job for to keep him out of trouble, Elias was guessing, a wild shot in the dark based on a single faded photo of a woman he had found in the man's wallet, a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus Thorne. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, and in that silence, Elias knew he had hit the mark. The professional mask had slipped. This was no longer just business for Thorne. It was personal. How? Thorne began, his voice tight with fury. I know a lot of things, Elias bluffed, pressing his advantage. I know about the dump sites. I know about the cover-up. And I know about you. You have my friends. I have your family. It seems we have a classic standoff. So here's the trade. My people for yours. There's a clearing at the old Miller's Ridge lookout. 1 hour. You bring the journalist and the old man, unharmed. I'll bring David. You come alone, Thorne. If I see a single one of your goons, David dies, and I disappear back into these woods. And I will spend the rest of my life hunting you. Do we have a deal? He could hear Thorne's breathing, harsh and ragged over the phone. He had backed the man into a corner. Thorne, the man who never lost, who didn't play by the rules, was being forced to play by Elias's. 1 hour. Thorne snarled, and the line went dead. Elias looked at the terrified man in the chair. Looks like you're going home, David, he said, his voice cold. He cut the man's bonds. Now, you and I are going for a walk. The final confrontation was set. On a lonely ridge, under the cold light of the moon, 2 wars, Thomas Miller's and Elias Vance's, were about to come to a head, and only one of them could walk away.